have the most recent excavations at Jericho uncovered evidence of Joshua's conquest of the city as the Bible describes. Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is Bible and Archaeology. This is something that we have gotten several emails about, wondering why we're not talking about the new excavations at Jericho, overseen by Lorenzo Negro and run by the Italian-Palestinian expedition, exploring this site and uncovering some new materials that some people say supports the Bible's idea of the conquest of this city by Joshua. This is not what the archaeology or the archaeologists are saying, and I think the easiest way to go through that is to simply look at some of the publications that have come out from this dig and see what they say about the site and this proposed connection between a biblical narrative and the archaeology on the ground, because those two things do not go hand in hand here, as they rarely ever do anywhere. So we're going to get into some of what the reports have said, and to do so, we're going to focus on a couple details, because from what I've been sent, it seems like there's some cherry picking going on in what the dig reports are talking about and what people are choosing to focus on. Cherry picking that is aimed, unsurprisingly, towards things connected to fortifications and to late Bronze Age settlement, but focus that ignores when those things maybe are dated to, the scale that they are talked about, or how the excavation itself talks about its understanding of the relationship between the site and the narrative that the Bible puts forward. So specifically, we are going to look at Garstang's wall mistake, this wall that Garstang, who excavated there in the 1930s, dated to the late Bronze Age, which does not date to the late Bronze Age, what this excavation is saying about the date of that wall, the Middle Bronze destruction and how that informs what we know about the site and what may be the hands responsible for a biblical narrative knew, what the late Bronze Age remains are telling us, and then what they're saying about this relationship between the archaeology and the Bible, because there have been new excavations happening at Jericho. They have been finding new materials, but they have not overturned the position that is held by the majority of archaeologists and biblical scholars that the biblical narrative's account of Joshua and Jericho is a literary creation that maybe drew on memories of a destroyed site or on what they could see of destruction at a site. But they're not proposing that the archaeology is supporting the destruction of Jericho by Joshua as the Bible relays it. So first, let's turn to Garstang's wall, because this is an underlying problem for several of the emails that we've gotten about this, where they're turning to the excavations of John Garstang in the 1930s and a wall that Garstang dated to the late Bronze Age that actually dates to the early Bronze Age, something that Kathleen Kenyon noted in their excavations. But for a variety of reasons that don't fully make sense, people seem to have a problem with that correction and have expected the new excavations to go back to what Garstang has said, but that's not what they're doing. So here we're going to look at a report, an interim report that came out in 2024, looking at this Garstang late Bronze, early Bronze wall confusion. So in Area B North, Garstang's trench was cleaned out. The visible structures are, of course, Sultan 3C main inner wall. This is a wall that dates to the early Bronze Age. And on top, a Sultan 3C reconstruction. A little bit further down, just upon these strata, the stone foundation lined with big stones supports another ordinary wall made of beige bricks, which is nearly later than the early Bronze Age structures underlying it, and on the ground of scattered pottery finds might be tentatively attributed to the late Bronze Age or to the early Iron Age. These scattered materials may have been what led Garstang to erroneously attribute the massive structures below to the late Bronze Age. So what they're talking about here is an early bronze wall onto which a late bronze wall was built. But because Garstang found some pottery that dated to the late Bronze Age, they identified the larger wall below it to the late Bronze Age as well, a larger wall below that had a destruction layer that would match what Garstang hoped to find in doing archaeology to support the biblical narrative. And I'm not speaking out of line here when I say that Garstang wanted to find materials to support what the Bible has to say, because if we turn to this publication here, John Garstang of the University of Liverpool, right, excavated from 1930 to 1936, this had the explicit goal of demonstrating the reliability of the biblical account of Joshua. So when they dug to find things to support this position, a perspective that led them to make mistakes like missing that the wall is not the same wall, that there is an early Bronze Age wall underneath this late Bronze Age wall. So the newer excavations here continue on the perspective that was put forward by Kathleen Kenyon, that that wall is an early bronze wall, that there is material late bronze, yes. Those are not the same, though. This is a mistake in Garstang's reporting that is embedded deeply in perspectives of Joshua and Jericho held by individuals who want to find a way to pair the Bible to the archaeology. They see in this something that was put forward that has been squashed down by later scholars, where Garstang had it right. And it seems that there was some hope that these newer excavations would go back to what Garstang had said, which is not what they have done. But this is a detail that's been ignored, and instead focus has just shifted to, well, there are late Bronze Age finds, so maybe that supports this. That's not what Lorenzo Negro has published in these materials. If we turn to this publication, the wall was redated to the early Bronze Age by Kathleen Kenyon. Again, it was already placed in the early Bronze Age before these new excavations, and definitively identified by the Sapienza Mota expedition, that is the new expedition, with the double city walls of Sultan III. That's early Bronze III, 2500 to 2350. So this is not a late Bronze Age wall that suffered any destruction at the hands of Joshua. So first off, Garstang's wall, still wrong. It is an early bronze wall that suffered destruction, onto which, yes, a late Bronze Age wall was built, but not a wall that fits that description that you are wanting to find if you're looking at the Bible and looking at the archaeology, or a destruction layer that matches what you would want to find if you're looking at the Bible and then trying to look at the archaeology. Next, we need to look towards the middle Bronze Age destruction at the site, because this is a destruction layer that gets connected to an idea of Joshua's conquest because of its scale. The problem being, it does not date to the time period that the Bible says Joshua's conquest should have happened. The Middle Bronze destruction, according to the most recent excavations, occurred in 1550. So there's not a pairing between that Middle Bronze Age destruction, which again, here dates to 1550 to 1520 on radiocarbon samples, and the idea of a destruction connected to Joshua. So that Middle Bronze destruction layer, not connected. The early bronze walls, not connected. This is a piling up of details that works against the idea of the biblical narrative. But if you're simply looking for materials to say, well, they found more destruction, okay, that is the way people are working through this. Again, cherry picking out details that they like, that there's a destruction, that there is a late Bronze Age wall built on top of an early Bronze Age wall, that there is late Bronze Age settlement, finding these details, taking them out, but not looking at how they're talking about the broader context of what they are finding. Now, the last thing we should turn to is the late Bronze Age remains, because this is something that then they say, aha, but the site wasn't abandoned in the late Bronze Age, it was present in the late Bronze Age, giving a space for Joshua to come in and destroy it. So if we turn to what happened in the late Bronze Age at this site, we do have remains that are identified, and some of them at the head of the Cyclopean Wall, that there is a wall that is erected after the final destruction of that Middle Bronze Age city. Yes, there are late Bronze Age remains. Yes, there are some late Bronze Age fortifications. However, as you can see here, they describe it as scanty late Bronze Age remains. Jericho was still occupied in the late Bronze Age, although in a reduced scale. There is some fortification there, yes, adding a mud brick wall on top of the surviving crest of the Cyclopean Wall. But that doesn't mean that it is what the Bible wants it to be. And this page from their report is a wildly helpful page. If you have someone who has a question and says, no, but they do support the idea of Joshua and Jericho. The new excavations do. The new excavations do support this. It's simply not true. And they wrote about it. They put it in print. As with any literary narrative, the biblical text has its internal chronology, which fixes Joshua around 1480 BC. Again, taking the Bible's chronology, 1480, that is after that Middle Bronze Age destruction. So that's out of bounds. And when we look over the history of excavation, there are individuals who think that the biblical account should have had a literal archaeological correspondence, although it's now accepted that this perspective is methodologically erroneous. It nevertheless deserves some comment. As a basic premise, one should remember that archaeology rarely succeeds in matching written sources and excavated evidence. Only the retrieval of extraordinarily well-stratified, inscribed items may allow such a positive correlation. One may imagine that the terrible destruction suffered by the Canaanite city both in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC had surely become part of the local shared memory, and possibly were narrated as the Jerichoans had been able to overcome them almost every time. There is no way, however, to link them directly to the Bible, except for the fact that the biblical author may have reused one of these stories to validate the historicity of his narrative. The ruins of Tel es Sultan are far older than the alleged date of Joshua's conquest. Nonetheless, the already famous ruins of Jericho were exploited by the biblical author, giving them an everlasting fame. The dig reports say there is not a connection between Joshua and Jericho as the Bible says. The material does not support it. The chronology of the site does not support it. The site supports the idea of a rich history of destruction at Jericho. Yes. Of a long history of settlement at Jericho. Absolutely. But it does not give a connection between Joshua and the destruction of Jericho. May it have given the grounds for the creation of that story as you see in the Bible? Possibly. It's very possible, as they say, that they could have looked at the destruction, a tradition there, and created that story. But that story is a creation off of potentially memories of destruction at the site. There is not new archaeological evidence that supports a connection between Joshua and the destruction of Jericho.